The vaults beneath Persepolis held enough silver to buy every city in the ancient world twice over. Tens of thousands of talents, stacked bricks of bullion stretching across chamber after chamber, guarded by the most powerful military force on Earth. By 330 BCE, when Alexander the Great's soldiers broke down those doors and held their torches to the walls, they stood frozen, not because of fear, because of what they saw. 200 years of accumulated wealth, piled so high it required 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels just to carry it away. The greatest single seizure of treasure in the ancient world. But here is the question that historians have been wrestling with ever since. If Persia owned all that silver, if 20 to 30 subject nations poured their wealth into Persian coffers across 2 centuries, then why, when Alexander arrived with a force that was vastly outnumbered by Persian armies, did the empire simply collapse? Why didn't the richest empire in the world fight back? The answer isn't military. It isn't about Alexander's genius, or Persian cowardice, or the gods of Macedon. The answer is economic. And it's the same answer that explains why wealthy empires, wealthy nations, and wealthy institutions keep dying the same death, century after century, all the way to the present day. The Achaemenid Empire didn't fall because it ran out of silver. It fell because it hoarded too much of it. And in doing so, it strangled the very economy it was trying to protect. This is the story of the most structurally elegant economic trap in ancient history. And once you see the pattern, you'll start recognizing it everywhere. The architecture of an empire. Start with the size. Because to understand what Persia built and what it broke, you need to feel the scale of it. In 550 BCE, Cyrus the Great united the Persian and Median peoples and launched a campaign of conquest that would, within 3 decades, produce the largest empire the world had ever seen. By the time Darius I took the throne in 522 BCE, the Achaemenid Empire stretched from the Aegean coast of modern Turkey in the west to the Indus River in the east, from the Caspian Sea in the north to the Nile Delta in the south. It contained Egypt, Babylon, Lydia, Phrygia, Armenia, Sogdia, Bactria, and the fringes of India. Somewhere between 35 and 50 million people lived under Achaemenid rule. At the time, roughly 44% of the entire world's population. That number is worth sitting with. No empire before or since has controlled so large a share of humanity. And Darius, the great administrator, the builder king, understood immediately what was required to hold it together. You need roads. You need communication. You need a unified legal code. You need taxation. And you need money. He constructed the Royal Road, a 2,500-kilometer highway from Susa to Sardis, serviced by relay stations and mounted couriers who could carry a message across the entire empire in 15 days. He standardized weights and measures across every satrapy. He introduced a bimetallic monetary standard, the gold daric and the silver siglos, the first imperial coinage system of its kind in the ancient world. Then he did something that seemed, at the time, like an act of supreme administrative brilliance. He built the tribute system, the machine that ate itself. Here is how the tribute system worked, according to Herodotus, who documented it with the precision of a forensic accountant. Darius divided the empire into 20 satrapies, administrative provinces, each governed by a satrap, a royal governor answerable directly to the king. And each satrapy was assigned a fixed annual silver tribute, calibrated precisely to its agricultural output and economic productivity. Ionia and its neighbors, 400 talents of silver per year. Lydia and Phrygia, 500 talents. Egypt, 700 talents, plus 120,000 measures of grain. Babylon, the wealthiest province, 1,000 talents of silver plus 4 months of military provisions for the entire army. India, fabled for its gold, 360 talents of gold dust annually, the highest assessment of any single province. Add it all up across all 20 satrapies, and the annual tribute flowing into Persian coffers reached approximately 14,560 Euboean talents of silver equivalents every single year. Modern historians have estimated that across 190 years of Achaemenid rule, the empire received the equivalent of 1,877,200 talents of silver in cumulative tribute. That is a number almost too large to hold in the mind. Now here is the critical question. What happened to all that silver? The answer, documented in clay tablet archives from Persepolis and corroborated by every major ancient source, is this: most of it went into the treasury vaults and stayed there. The Persian kings hoarded it, melted it down, stored it underground in Persepolis, Susa, Ecbatana, Babylon, and Pasargadae. Scholars at the Encyclopedia Ironica, drawing on the Persepolis fortification tablets, thousands of clay records detailing the day-to-day operations of the imperial administration, confirm that Persia was an essentially silverized but coin-less economy. Silver existed. It moved, but it moved as unminted bullion, weighed on scales, not as circulating coinage. And the silver that flowed upward to the central treasuries almost never flowed back out. This is the hidden flaw, not in the collection system, in the distribution system, or rather, in the total absence of one. The deflation trap. To understand why hoarding silver kills an economy, you need to understand what silver actually does when it circulates. Money is not wealth. This is the single most misunderstood fact in economic history, and it has destroyed more civilizations than any army. Money is a medium. Its function is not to be accumulated. Its function is to facilitate exchange. When a Babylonian merchant sells grain to an Anatolian trader, who pays a craftsman in Susa, who buys copper from an Armenian miner, silver is the lubricant moving through that chain. It doesn't create value by existing. It creates value by moving. The moment it stops moving, the chain seizes. The Persepolis treasury tablets show something deeply troubling. Workers in the royal workshops, masons, carpenters, craftsmen, were technically paid wages in silver, but in practice, payments continued to be made partly in kind, rations of grain, wine, livestock, because actual coined silver was in short supply in the domestic economy. The metal was there, in the vaults. The economy needed it to circulate, but the kings kept pulling it out of circulation faster than it flowed back in. The consequence, documented in Babylonian price records of the period, was noticeable price deflation in the core of the empire. When the money supply contracts while economic activity continues, prices fall. And falling prices sound wonderful until you understand what they actually signal. The economy is choking. Merchants aren't investing because the purchasing power of the currency is uncertain. Farmers aren't expanding production because they can't calculate returns. Tax revenues, fixed in the tribute assessments that Darius set up and which scholars confirm, remained essentially unchanged for over a century, begin to diverge from the actual economic reality of the provinces paying them. The tribute rates, Herodotus records, were still the same amounts which Artaphernes established under Darius I generations later. Fixed assessments in a contracting economy. Think about what that means. The satrapies were being squeezed at static rates for a century, while the productive capacity of those economies strained under silver scarcity. The system was eating itself, the moment the flaw became visible. In 486 BC, Darius died. His son Xerxes inherited the empire, and with it, a structural flaw that was already calcifying into the foundations of Persian power. Xerxes is famous in popular history for his invasion of Greece in 480 BC, the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, the naval disaster at Salamis, the burning of Athens. But the economic story of Xerxes is far more consequential than the military one, because Xerxes did two things simultaneously that transformed a structural weakness into an active crisis. First, he spent. The expedition against Greece was staggering in its logistics. Years of preparation, conscription across every satrapy, a fleet of 700 naval vessels, an army of hundreds of thousands. Herodotus records that Pytheas the Lydian, one of the wealthiest private citizens in the empire, offered to fund part of the campaign personally. That is how much the mobilization cost. The campaign failed catastrophically at Salamis in 480 and at Plataea in 479 BCE, and Xerxes retreated home, having burned through enormous quantities of treasury silver to fund a war he lost. Second, he built. Back in Persepolis, Xerxes commissioned the Gate of All Nations and the Hall of 100 Columns, among the most architecturally ambitious projects in ancient history. The exorbitant cost of these projects, on top of the Greek campaign, placed a crushing burden of taxation on provincial subjects to compensate for treasury depletion. Revolts erupted immediately. Egypt rebelled under the strain. Babylon rebelled twice. Xerxes crushed them, but the cost of suppression compounded the fiscal pressure further. The pattern had begun. A government spending more than it could sustain. Revenue structures that couldn't adapt. Subject populations pushed to the breaking point by taxation to compensate for imperial overextension. This pattern has a name that modern economists recognize instantly. This is fiscal overextension, and it is the first stage of every economic collapse in the historical record. What made Persia's version unique and uniquely fatal was that unlike a government printing paper money to cover deficits, Persia couldn't inflate its way out. The money was silver. It was hard. There was no printing press. But there was something equally dangerous. The habit of hoarding had created a reserve of wealth that felt permanent, felt infinite, and therefore insulated the kings from recognizing the economy's decay until it was too late to stop. #the slow bleed. After Xerxes was assassinated in 465 BC, killed by his own minister Artabanus, the empire entered a prolonged period of structural decline that its own records document with grim clarity. Artaxerxes I, Xerxes' successor, maintained the empire but faced constant provincial pressure. Egypt broke away multiple times. The empire spent silver funding Greek factions against each other, paying Athens' enemies to prevent Athenian expansion, rather than investing in productive capacity. This is the fiscal equivalent of paying protection money. It preserves the structure at the cost of economic vitality. Under Artaxerxes II, the longest reigning Achaemenid king at 45 years, the empire maintained surface stability. Grand building projects continued at Persepolis. The summer capital at Ecbatana was expanded with gilded columns and silver roof tiles. But satraps, the provincial governors, were accumulating independent wealth and power at an accelerating rate. When the center weakens, the periphery strengthens, and in Persia's case, the periphery was beginning to look more like a network of autonomous warlords than a unified imperial system. The tribute still flowed in, but less of it reached the center. Satraps skimmed. Generals demanded. Court factions consumed. The ancient equivalent of institutional corruption, metastasizing through every administrative layer of an empire that was too large and too rigidly structured to self-correct. Here is the forensic summary of the bleed. In 190 years of operation, the Persian Empire received approximately 1,877,200 talents of silver in tribute. When Alexander broke open the vaults in 330 BC, he found 180,000 talents, roughly 5,000 tons of silver. That is only 9.6% of the cumulative intake, even accounting for legitimate expenditure. The rest had moved, through war, through building, through court consumption, through satrap appropriation. What should have been the circulatory system of the wealthiest economy in the ancient world had become a draining wound. #the killing blow. By 336 BC, when Darius III took the throne, the Achaemenid Empire was an empire in name and geography, but was no longer an empire in economic cohesion. The satraps commanded their own armies. The tribute system still functioned, but the revenues were fragmented. The Persian army had shifted from a citizen soldier force built on patriotic obligation to a mercenary force built on silver payment. And the king who needed silver most was the king most dependent on silver continuing to flow from an economy that could no longer produce it at adequate velocity. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with approximately 37,000 men. Persian satrapal armies in Asia Minor outnumbered him locally, but they fought defensive, fragmented, uncoordinated campaigns. Because the economic system that should have powered rapid central mobilization had already failed. The treasury at Persepolis was full. The empire's functioning economy was starved. Alexander defeated the Persians at Granicus in 334 B, at Issus in 333 B, and at Gaugamela in 331 B. Then he walked into Persepolis, and his soldiers carried out somewhere between 180,000 and 200,000 talents of gold and silver. Estimates range from $300 billion to $500 billion in modern equivalents, the most significant single appropriation of wealth in the ancient world. He distributed it to his soldiers. He funded city building across the Hellenistic world. He unleashed it into circulation. And here is the forensic proof that the hoarding had been the flaw all along. When Alexander released that silver into the economy, the price of wheat in Athens surged from 5 to 16 drachmas per medimnos within years. Not because the economy was healthy, because the sudden flood of liquidity that Persia had suppressed for 2 centuries hit markets that had been adapted to scarcity. The silver that should have been circulating for a century exploded into the ancient economy all at once, and the resulting inflation demonstrated, in reverse, exactly what its absence had done to the Persian provincial economies for generations. The hoarded silver had been deflationary inside the empire. The released silver was inflationary outside it. Same metal, different pattern of movement, completely different economic outcomes. Hashtag the pattern that keeps repeating. Here is what you need to understand about the Achaemenid case, because this is where the historical forensics translate into living knowledge. The Persian kings were not foolish. Darius was one of the most sophisticated administrators in ancient history. The tribute system was rational, calibrated, and functionally elegant. The problem was not intelligence. The problem was a structural assumption embedded in how they understood wealth. They equated the accumulation of silver with the strength of the empire. More silver in the treasury meant more power, more security, more permanence. But the accumulation of silver in the treasury was not power. It was the withdrawal of power from the economy. Every talent hoarded was a talent not circulating through merchant networks, not paying craftsmen, not funding agricultural investment, not enabling the provincial economies to grow their way to sustainable productivity. The treasury looked stronger every year. The empire's economic skeleton was becoming more brittle every year. This exact pattern repeats. Societies that mistake the storage of value for the generation of value. Governments that confuse balance sheet strength with systemic health. The sign of decline is never sudden collapse. It is the divergence between apparent wealth and actual productive capacity, the growing gap between what the treasury holds and what the economy can generate. Persia's treasury was never fuller than in the decades just before it fell. When the satrapies began revolting not out of cultural resentment, but out of genuine economic desperation, when provinces were being taxed at Darius-era fixed rates in economies contracting under silver scarcity, the ideological legitimacy of the empire collapsed alongside the economic one. People accept authority when they perceive it as functional. When the functional chain breaks, authority becomes coercion, and coercion, at imperial scale, requires infinite resources to maintain, resources the empire could no longer mobilize, because the silver it held was no longer moving. The structural flaw was not the tribute system. The structural flaw was the endpoint of the tribute system, a vault that silver entered and almost never left. The greatest empire of the ancient world built its economic architecture around a terminal node, a point of accumulation with no mechanism of redistribution, and in doing so, it built its own collapse into the foundation. Hashtag what survives the pattern. The Achaemenid case teaches a clean forensic lesson that cuts through ideological noise. Wealth that circulates builds. Wealth that accumulates without circulation corrodes the system around it. The satrapies that survived the collapse of Persian power best, Babylon, Egypt, the Anatolian provinces, were those with the most developed internal trade networks, the most sophisticated local banking systems, and the most diversified economic bases. They were not dependent on the Persian silver supply chain because they had built functional alternatives. The Morale banking firm in Babylonia, documented in the Morale archive from the period, operated complex credit networks, land management, and financial intermediation entirely independent of the royal treasury's state of health. When Persia fell, Babylon's economy continued because it had never been fully synchronized to Persia's silver hoarding rhythm. The lesson is not about precious metals versus other assets. The lesson is about velocity, about the difference between an economy that moves wealth and an economy that stores it. Persia stored it, and what stores without moving, in economics as in biology, begins to stagnate, then putrefy, then collapse, while looking, from the outside, perfectly preserved. Hashtag the warning in the vault. The vaults of Persepolis were opened once in 330 BC and never refilled. What Alexander took out in a season had taken 200 years to accumulate. The empire it funded was already dead by the time the doors opened. The silver was the corpse of a functional economy, preserved in the dark, still recognizable, still counting as wealth in every ledger, but no longer connected to the living system that had produced it. The forensic verdict is clear. The Achaemenid Empire did not fall to a superior army. It fell to a superior understanding of what money is for. Alexander understood, intuitively or deliberately, that the silver wasn't power unless it moved. He took it out of the vault and sent it into the world, and within 30 years it had transformed the Hellenistic economy entirely, funding new cities, new trade networks, new political structures that would shape the Mediterranean world for 3 centuries. The Persian kings, for all their administrative brilliance, for all the royal roads and the standardized weights and the perfectly calibrated tribute assessments, never answered the one question that mattered most. Not how do you collect silver, but what do you do with it once you have it? That question still doesn't have an easy answer. But the evidence is in, and the verdict has been written in the ruins of Persepolis for 2,355 years.